for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Let me see if mine's recording one moment. Okay, yeah, mine says it's doing something.
We're good.
Okay, good.
Okay.
All right.
We're good. So thank you so much for joining me today. I've been following you for over a year now, and I'm very familiar with your work, Kundalini Yoga, sexual energy transmutation, and so much more. But in order not to mess up your bio, and I will have a link to your website in the description box, as well as your YouTube channel. I'll just read your bio out of my phone.
All right.
So just not to mess it up, just for people who are not familiar with your work. So Akal holds a master's in applied exercise physiology and has worked in both exercise-related fields as well as a Kundalini Yoga teacher for over 20 years. Over the last 10 years, you have applied your understanding of yoga, tantra, energy work, Taoist practices, and meditation in aiding men in transforming their understanding of intimacy and sexual energy. And you also help couples and individuals understand their relationship dynamics and life path through the lens of astrology and human design. Okay, perfect. So I kind of want to start off with the first question, which is, I know you've worked for so many years with couples. So if you could name 3 of the most predominant misunderstandings between couples, we'll try to talk polarity rather than gender. What do you think these would be?
I mean, I won't say misunderstandings, but I would say more sort of like roadblocks, areas where there tends to be a friction. And the frictions that arise, I generally see often has to do with how the 2 individuals operate energetically independently. And the best way I can say this is, you know, I always use the same expression. So those of you who've watched me speak before, I always use the same analogy basically, which is 2 eyes, 2 individuals, when they come together, they create a we. The energies, not our own, well, I would say generally speaking, are not always compatible. In fact, most of the time, our energies are inherently not compatible on some level. So frictions will naturally arise. So certain dynamics, we'll use one of the areas that I find is the most common roadblock, which is space. That in generally, and again, I'm a guy, so I come from the sort of male perspective, so I have a little bit of a bias in that regard. So the need for space in relationships, in terms of like the eyes need to have space so they can realize their individuality and they don't become too intertwined. And in terms of, and then some people want to get lost in the intertwining. So that's one of the conflicts I've seen, is that there are, in some situations, in some relationships, one individual in the relationship wants more and more and more and more connection. The other one's like, I need to breathe. So that I think is the most common, in my experience, the most common issue. And so sometimes I tell guys or whoever I'm dealing with, if you have a room in the house or in the apartment or the condo or wherever you live, where you can sleep alone on certain nights, maybe like 1 night a week, just sleep alone, spend your time alone, sleep alone, be in your own aura and your own energy, because I think it's really essential, because I think in a lot of ways we tend to lose our identity in relationships. And then the problem is that issues will arise when we lose our sense of identity. We'll have energy issues, we'll have lack of clarity. A number of things could possibly come up in those situations, in which oftentimes there's a beautiful remedy, which is to spend some time alone. The other thing I found is, and this leads into my second point, which is intimacy. Intimacy tends to suffer in situations where there's not adequate space. And I don't care how much we love our partners, the reality is that if we're around this person all the time and we don't have adequate amount of space, it gets old. It gets old. I mean, you
Sure.
know, one year after another year after another year after another year with the same person. And I've heard this issue rise many times. And again, it's the need that I found for me anyway, my solution that I've worked through as well as I've helped other individuals is if you have that one night where you can be alone, sleep in your own aura, sleep in your own field, then when you kind of have a renewed desire for the person you're with. So that's one of the solutions. Now the intimacy being the second area where I feel is a roadblock is I'm going to come from a very male perspective here. I don't know how many relationships I've seen utterly destroyed because guys ejaculate too much. And I don't mean like, it's not necessarily about frequency because every man can kind of sort of recharge at a different pace and a different rate. But the reality is that the process of ejaculation naturally severs a bond. And that natural severing of a bond, again, I'm speaking from a male perspective, as soon as that bond is severed, there's at least this is my experience and experience of a lot of men I'm with, is they need to lick their wounds. They've lost some energy. That energy loss for some folks, for some men, is much more profound. It's much more powerful. It's much more intense. For me, I generally don't want to bond with the person. If I ejaculate, I mean, I'll bond in the sense of like, we'll have a conversation, maybe a little bit of cuddling and that kind of thing, but I don't want to be intimate for probably 2 or 3 more days. I've had sufficient time for my sexual energy to build back up. And there are times where my energy is particularly low, where I don't want any intimacy for over a week or 2 weeks. I mean, that's just how it is. And so for me, and again, I'm speaking from my perspective, sometimes I don't like to release a month is the period of time I like to kind of like, all right, I let it build up over the course of a month, and then I'll release when my body tells me it's time. It's not the ego, it's my body tells me it's time. And I usually can tell because there's just a lot of pressure built up. So that would be like the kind of the second area I wrote generically in terms of from a man's perspective, is that if the charge is high, your desire is high. And for me also, there's the experience of my desire to connect with my own body is also high. And if I'm more in tune with my own body, if I'm more in tune with my own energy, if I feel, I use the term horny is high, because the reality is when I'm horny, my body feels very enlivened. I feel very vital. I feel very rich. I don't ever want to let that go. And again, I wait until my body says, all right, it's okay to let it go. And then I do. So that would be like a kind of a second area is around the intimacy issues. Then a third area I would say would be resentment. So addressing resentments as they arise. Communication, which is, it's almost cliche to say, oh, one of the issues in a relationship is communication. Well, yeah. However, there's verbal and nonverbal communication, and there are verbal and nonverbal ways in which to address any sort of resentments that rise. But if we let the resentment simmer in our being, it becomes very malefic. It becomes very sort of toxic. And that toxicity will build and build and build. And then all of a sudden you'll notice little things like, oh, my partner's breath smells bad today, or their body odor smells bad today. And you'll find like little reasons to kind of pick at the person, even if you're not directing your sort of attacks at the person. In some cases, some people do, but I tend to be personally more repressive in nature. So I will sit there and stew on, I don't like the way her breath smells today, or, whatever the issue is, I'll let it simmer within myself. So I've always found that communicating, not necessarily like, oh, your breath is off, but the reality is I need to communicate if something occurred at some point during the week or during the day in which it triggered me in some particular way. Usually I'll let it sit before so I can process it and understand how that affected me, impacted me, and then I need to communicate it. Because the longer I hold it, the more, like I said, it becomes toxic. And then I start fault finding. And again, this is something I found to be very common in a lot of people. And it's interesting because I've had clients who I've worked with where they've let the resentment simmer for years. They just don't address these issues. So verbal communication obviously is one issue. And then there's nonverbal communication. When I was going through Kundalini Yoga teachers training, we learned something called Venus Kriyas. And Venus Kriyas, they're like connection practices. If you have a lot of resentments and a lot of anger towards the individual you're with, and let's say you're doing a gazing practice, it can be quite challenging because a lot of the Venus Kriyas involve gazing at one another. So there was one particular practice which I thought was quite cool, because what you would do is you would sit back to back. So you're sitting back to back with your partner. There's both of you kind of like angry and have resentments. So you sit back to back until things simmer down, as opposed to lashing out. So that's one of the nonverbal ways in which that, because sometimes like the verbal communication, you know, you start to trigger one another, and then it just builds and it builds and it gets worse and it gets worse and it gets worse and it gets worse. And there's no amount of talking will find us. There is no solution, and no amount of talking is going to remedy anything. So, and sometimes doing things like sitting back to back and just kind of breathing and being present with your breath while feeling the other individual's breath through your back, that sort of thing is actually very calming. And once the energies are calmed down, then communicate it. So, but anyway, those are kind of the three areas that I see could be, you know, like I said, roadblocks.
So you said something really interesting for me, because you said that no amount of talking would diffuse that kind of toxic energy. And I like so many people would say that the remedy for that thing is to actually communicate that. But you think that even talking about it wouldn't be enough to diffuse that amount of resentment. So do you suggest anything else other than, well, let's say people have tried the Venus Kriya and also it didn't work? Are there any other kind of like modalities that can work?
Well, obviously talking is the eventual solution, but eventual solution, right? So meaning if two individuals are triggered, if two individuals are operating from a place of anger or resentment, what ends up happening is you're triggering each other's egos, and it becomes this Ouroboros dog chasing its tail situation where there's no solution to be had. Right. So sometimes you need to not talk. And I'm not talking about silent treatment either. I mean, literally like, hey, let's stay connected. Let's stay literally in touch, sit back to back, breathe. When there's calmer energies, when calmer minds prevail, right? When calmer minds prevail, then let's talk. Because then all of a sudden you have a little more objectivity, you know. And again, this is where dozens of times for me, because like when I get stirred up, I'm a very emotional communicator. So when I'm communicating emotionally and I'm communicating from a place of anger or resentment, I can hear nothing. I can hear nothing. I just defensive. So so that's basically what I generally suggest is, hey, let's simmer down, stay connected, because we're not going to avoid this or repress it or run from it, but we're going to wait until calmer minds, the calmer heads prevail. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
In your experience, it does, because well, I understand what you're saying, and for me the key word for that type of communication is, as you said, you have to get out of the small self, you have to get out of the ego. And it's the process of that, like because it doesn't happen automatically, because we're very like, the habit is to go to the ego, the habit is to identify with your ego or your small self or whatever you want to call it. So it's just these steps or this process of, okay, I'm getting out of my ego. So this is what you're describing. This is like the Venus Kriya, as you said, like just to give yourself that space to get out of your ego in order to be able to connect that this
Mhm.
person is not the enemy, you know. So like this shift and change of perspective, that okay, we have a misunderstanding, and we need to work it out, but not from a space of separateness, but of a space of being connected. So it's just getting there is really the thing. And this brings me to the second question, like, have you, like, did you work, like, if you worked, or did you work with couples who have the same spiritual beliefs, or they are both spiritually inclined, and how does it help the relationship if both couples are kind of, you know, operate from that space, like a spiritually inclined or have the same spiritual belief? Does it make things easier in terms of relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it doesn't have to be the same spiritual path.
Yeah.
Meaning, like, you know, I'll use an example. And if my ex-wife would theoretically ever be watching this, I apologize. But when we first started seeing each other, I was back when I was like 22, 23. I wasn't really, you know, I mean, I was into spiritual stuff, but more from a place of philosophy at that point. I didn't quite, there was no depth to it. It was just words, words, words. So, so what ended up happening, but she was very spiritual. She was very, very, very sort of lit by the time she was around in her early 20s. So, you know, what she taught me at that point is that she would question our relationship at that point because we weren't, quote unquote, equally yoked. And it's somewhat true, is that you want somebody who's going to be able to come along with you on the path. And the other thing is that it has to do with language. I tend to speak ad nauseum about spiritual stuff, and you know, so anyone I'm generally with in terms of romantic entanglements, generally speaking, if they're not spiritual on some level, then it's like I have nothing to say. So that's also important. But what is interesting though is it doesn't. I think in certain, let's say if you're on a religious path, Christianity, Islam, whatever it may be, maybe it's more important because those are more social constructs that go along with the spiritual practice. And if there's a social construct that goes along with the spiritual practice, then oftentimes, yes, both individuals kind of need to exist within that social construct. However, if two individuals come together and they're just generally spiritual, I think it's a good thing. And again, it has to do with the fact that the language is similar, they can communicate. You know, and other thing is that having spiritual practices, meditation, yoga, Tai Chi, Qigong, prayer, whatever it may be, it makes you a better person. And if it makes you a better person, well, you're going to be a better partner. So in terms of my own criteria, it's absolutely essential that the other person has some, again, they don't have to speak the same language necessarily, but they have some sort of mindfulness. And that's kind of generically part of my criteria is this a mindful person? So yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think about, there's a lot of talk about non-monogamous and polyamory. So do you have any opinions about that, or how does it, like, do you think it works? Or no judgment, but from your own like experience and perspective and stuff.
All right, so my ego loves the idea of polyamory. My ego loves the idea of like, oh, I can have multiple sexual partners, right? And I think individuals get locked into, how do I explain this? So I don't want to use I guess I'll use a little esoteric language here. So we'll talk about chakras a little bit. So if I'm operating from, let's say, my sexual chakra, I can, you know, and I think this is true of a lot of individuals, if you're functioning from that space and that is a primary place that you have a concentration of energy, then what ends up happening is that concepts like, oh, I can sleep around with multiple partners becomes a thing. Like you can do that theoretically, right? So it sounds good. And I also like to think of like polyamory, sleeping around with multiple partners kind of falls into, and I'm not saying this for those people who have this as a serious part of the relationship. I'm not saying it's a kink necessarily, but for me, I tend to prefer monogamy. So for me, it's a kink. So it's a kink for me to want to sleep around with multiple partners because it's coming from a mental place and a mental space. And there's a rationalization that goes along with it. The reality, and again, I'll speak for me and a lot of men that I've worked with, is that even though we can psychologically say, oh, I could do this, this, and that. In fact, hey, I read a book where they said it's part of our biological heritage to, basically inseminate a woman and then move on to the next woman in order to procreate and to make sure that the strongest seed survives and whatever to expand my my lineage. Now, the reality is that I always have to. First off, I don't like rules in relationships, and generally speaking, I think when people enter into relationships, they need to have very clear-cut boundaries and rules that are set up from go. And one of those boundaries in some relationships would be, hey, can we have a conversation about like sleeping around? And if both individuals are like, hey, it's fine if you sleep around, you also need to point out something very specific, which is, okay, so if we're both agreeing that it's okay to sleep around, then we also have to be both okay with how the other person is going to emotionally respond. And we have to give the other person, the other individual in the relationship, the permission, or not even the permission, but they're allowed to respond how they naturally feel they're going to respond, whether it's jealousy or possessiveness or any of those things. They're entitled to their emotion and their feelings. So if I do not want to provoke those particular emotions, even if I'm in a sort of a non-monogamous situation, I have to consider the other person. So I think relationships, they need to have consideration as the foundation when we're talking about, are we going to be monogamous or non-monogamous? There's sometimes a rule, say, hey, this is a monogamous relationship, and we're both, again, if it's both agreed upon, then so be it, then there's no resentment there necessarily, although sometimes there can be. However, if one individual is a little wishy-washy and kind of like, thinks, hey, I can get away with sleeping around, I want to sleep around, it's going to build up some resentment if the other person is like, no, this is the rule. So the problem with rules is that there may be the other individual is not real cool with that rule. And so that's going to build resentment, going back to the resentment issue. And the resentment simmers and builds and builds and builds. It's going to destroy the intimacy. And if it destroys the intimacy, the individual who wasn't cool with the rules is going to start sleeping around. And again, there's no consideration of the other person's feelings. So from my perspective, I think relationships are all about agreements. And if the agreements need to be clear and the agreements need to be deep, they can't simply be philosophical. I've talked to one particular couple and they both read this book about polyamory. And they're like, oh, it sounds like a great idea. They were processing it philosophically. Then I asked them separately, because when I'm working with couples, I like to talk to them separately, never together, because they're I hate to say, a lot of couples, they lie. So I talk to each one separately.
Same for me.
Yep.
Yes, I do the same. Yeah. So
after the separate communication, what I end up finding is that I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought for a moment. We were talking about the
you talk polyamory, and when you talk with them separately,
right? So in the case of the couple who read the book, and this is one of those books that was very like it's very contemporary and it's very like social justice and like we can love everyone and la la la. Okay, that's fine, but it doesn't really take into consideration again, how is someone actually going to respond? Whether there's permission or not, oftentimes it still feels like cheating. Even if you have all this philosophical belief, because the intellect isn't always in alignment with the heart. So if there's no alignment there, there's it's severed. And so in the end, hey, we both agreed on this on a philosophical level, then it happens and the person feels crushed, right? So again, these are the things that people really need to consider deeply when they're talking about, you know, expanding the relationship into other situations. Now, if we're talking about threesomes and bringing in that kind of thing, I think could potentially happen more fluidly and more naturally because the couple is doing something together, but that's probably a different question. So, yeah.
Okay. I mean, we spoke offline about this, and you kind of expressed a lot of frustration from dealing with men and how they just don't get it when it comes to women in so many aspects. And I would like to just kind of pick your brain again about this. Like, what is it that men are really in your opinion bad at? Like, what is it that they don't get about women that will make things much more easier and will just kind of bridge the gap, if you will, between Venus and Mars? Like, we'll use the cheesy, corny kind of analogy.
Well, first off, thank you for the question, because it helps me exercise my New Year's resolution, which is anger into action. And so verbalizing this kind of helps me. I have a lot of anger about men, and I'm saying this anger, it exists because I've been there, done that. I'm not saying it's anger because, you know, I'm somehow perfect. I'm angry with men because I've been angry with myself and how I've treated women, let's say, you know, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And it was a lack of maturity on my part in those particular situations. Now, the thing that angers me most about how men approach women is, I would say it goes into the sexual realm, of course, but it has to do with the fact that men are trained by pornography, right? So even in the cases where men are not necessarily looking at pornography, men are trained by their own masturbation. They are trained to do things quickly. So male sexual energy will ramp up really fast because, let me create a little pause here. So male sexual energy ramps up really fast. If you can picture this, I saw this in a book. I don't remember which book. It was a Taoist book. Wonderful picture. It was one of the greatest, most profound images of my entire life that I've ever took in. And what it was two stick figures. It was the male stick figure and a female stick figure. The male stick figure, you know, again, we're talking about a circle, stick body, whatever. But on the male stick figure, it had a plus sign by the genitals and a minus sign by the heart. On the female stick figure, it had a plus sign by the heart and a minus sign by the genitals. And I was like, okay, that is a brilliant generalization. And now I'm not saying all women are like heart-centered and they don't immediately shift their sexual energy quickly, because I've known women who actually, in a lot of ways, they're able to heat up really quick. But again, that's not all women. So every man needs to, particularly when they're new into a relationship, they have to learn learn from her primarily. But you know, be open to your own observations, but also be open to how her body is communicating with you. And if she's verbally communicating, my preference is to when it's in sexual world, my preference has always been that there's no verbal communication. I prefer to simply be sensitive to her body. And the thing is that, again, but some women, you know, they're going to verbalize it and tell you, oh, do this, then do that, and, you know, whatever. But that kind of approach for me always made me feel like I was being micromanaged. And I was like, is this not the situation? Is that what we have going on here? But nonetheless, being sensitive to the fact that she takes a longer time to warm up. And that is a brilliant generalization. So entering into a new relationship, if you don't really know how she responds, that is the rule. keep it in mind. Just understand that it takes her longer to warm up. And you know, then the other thing is it has to do with aggression. How much aggression can she handle? You know, or how passive. You know, I tend towards passivity a lot of times. So in some women, would want more aggression. So I have to be able to modulate, this modulator word, I have to be able to sort of like determine, do I need to be more aggressive in this situation, or do I need to sort of pull back my energy? So the man needs to be very cognizant of his quote unquote divine masculine and how he's expressing it. Sometimes you need to pull back, sometimes you need to push forward. And again, her body will tell you. Like, is she gripping the sides of the bed in fear and terror? Like, that's relevant. So guys, don't get all caught up in your own needs. It's selfish.
Fantasy. Yeah. Right. And I always use this analogy. You cannot go to Italy with the map of France. You cannot.
Yeah.
I always use this analogy. Don't assume, even if you're not used to ask questions. It's like Brill, you know, just feel her out, man. Feel her out. Be more sensitive to the nuances. Like, is she moaning? Is there a pleasure moan there? Is she laying there like a dead fish? What are her facial expressions? Read her out. Come on. It's like a new country. Be curious.
Yep.
So yes, and it's just like, it's the same frustration that I get. Like, oh, but I thought all women like that. Well, not all women are the same.
Absolutely.
You know, exactly. Like, you cannot test drive the same car the same way. Why you don't think of human beings the same way? Not all cars, you cannot navigate the same car the same way. You have to kind of feel the car out. Feel your woman out, man. Feel your woman out.
Absolutely true.
So
absolutely true.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you know, one other area is that I've known men who generally don't enter into sexual circumstances unless they're drunk. There's alcohol in their system. That's terrible. Like, you know, let's say you're gay and you're entering even with another dude, and because there's two dudes, like, not every dude is ready to jump into something. You know what I mean? Like, there is sensitivity that is required here. And unfortunately, if it's drugs and alcohol involved, it will create a numbing effect. And also that sort of numbing effect, basically you become wrapped around your own selfish needs. And that's the thing that bothers me most about any sort of sexual situation, is when the person, and it's been reversed too. I've had women who've used me as a sex toy. So it goes both ways, and I'm all like crushed afterwards. Like, oh, she just used me. The reality is that it goes both ways. You know, where it's like we have to be cognizant of that. It's another human being, and I know there's supposed to be the way the culture is currently set up in the world, because of pornography, because of the sort of very liberal nature of everything. The reality is that there is a need to, how do I explain this? To sort of slow things down, to also realize that sex isn't just about, you know, hey, let's be frivolous and have fun and you know, have all this sex and have a great time. And it becomes so light and so, but the problem is it loses significance. It loses depth. It loses meaning. It loses, how do I explain it? It loses, it's a reflection of creation itself, right? It's a reflection of creation itself. It is, we are, in a way, when we're having sex, and it's not, this isn't just from a procreation standpoint, is the sexual connection will be greater always if we can recognize the profundity of it going into the situation. So entering into the dynamic, being sensitive, recognizing that, hey, this is profound. This isn't, you know, having light, fun sex is great every now and then, fine. But the reality is the majority of people who've come to see me, their primary complaint is the lack of profundity. These are individuals. They have their sexual connections are not profound. And so gay men in particular, a lot of the gay men I've worked with, that's their primary issue. You asked me the earlier question, like, what's the blocks in the relationships? Well, when it comes to gay men, it's the lack of profundity in the connection. Oftentimes because it's two dudes coming together and they both are always moving towards ejaculation. If you're always moving towards ejaculation, you can go there really, really fast. You can get there really, really quick. So there's almost an excuse not to have the profundity, not to recognize the fact that this act of, you know, sexual connection is reflecting creation itself. Like, it's all lost at that point. And so
it's sacred. It's sacred. Sex is sacred. And I hear you, because, well, it's like eating your favorite food every day. When you eat your favorite food every day, you don't crave it anymore, because there is nothing special about it anymore. You need to crave it, and you need to kind of enjoy it and long for it and actually strive to have it. It shouldn't be that easy, and it's not like playing hard to get kind of thing, but it's enjoy the process of actually kind of wanting someone and really want to court that person. And this it's a game, and it's a fun game, and it's a beautiful game, and it's a dance. So just don't skip the dance, man. Just don't skip the dance. It's the fun is in the dance. The whole thing is about the dance. It's the pleasure and not the, you know, if it's not ejaculation oriented, it's when sex is pleasure oriented. So everything is actually pleasurable, from texting, like everything is sex, everything is synergistic energy exchange. It's you can be like, yes, turned on from texting till the time you reach the bedroom. So why not? Why not enjoy the process?
Absolutely.
So
agreed.
I hear you. So since you are a Kundalini yoga teacher and you have many years of experience in that field, there is a lot of fluff about Kundalini everywhere on the internet, on YouTube, on whatnot, whatever. But from your experience and your studies and your research and your practices, what is the essence of Kundalini Yoga? If we can, like, we're not gonna, you know, kind of dive deep on this podcast, but maybe just give us a teaser about and how is it related in that sense to sexuality and relationships? Let's say, let's take it from that angle specifically.
Okay. So generically, Kundalini.
Yes.
So Kundalini Yoga, the system I went through it's a white tantric system, meaning, well, I don't want to go into all that, but the point is that it's about purity. And so what it is you're purifying the body, you're purifying all these things so that the energy can flow more freely. And I often reflect on, when I think about this idea of purification, I think about even like the sins, you know, the sins from the Bible, etc. All these things are basically, so if you sin, if you create certain sins, it creates an obstruction to energy. And so this energy, what people don't understand, and I always think this is interesting, I'm going to bring in sexual energy now. So sexual energy, it's interesting because people think it's like this separate thing. It's like this little separate thing here, and it's somehow not connected to the rest. Now, the reality is Kundalini is not sexual energy, right? Kundalini has sexual energy within it because it is a totality of energy. So whether we individual expresses that totality of energy, is kind of what it's all about. So what I mean by that is, let's say 15 years ago, when we'll say 20 years ago, when I first started doing Kundalini Yoga, my energy was quite low. So the totality of my energy, what we'll use a measuring cup, it was only like a quarter full. So I only had a quarter cup. And so as I started to do more purification practices, I started watching what I was eating, and I was, moderating the amount of exercise because I over-exercised, which burned me out. I was watching my stress levels. I started to learn all these different things, and I started to see that cup start to fill. And so, after 5 years of doing yoga and meditation, I got to about half full. And so now I'm like 3/4 full. I can still feel there's another quarter of my potential. So this idea of Kundalini is really about your latent potential. It's about this energy that sits, quote unquote, coiled up at the base of your spine. And it is waiting to awaken. And it's interesting because some of the manifestations that happen, a lot of the videos you see on YouTube, for instance, a lot of the videos are about the manifestations. People get really, really all tied up and like, oh, I'm going to get these cities or superpowers, or some people freak out. I was possessed by demons. They felt this like, oh, like my body started moving on its own, and they immediately equate it to be like demonic possession. Who knows? The reality is that things will simply manifest as this energy manifests. Now, what manifests as this energy starts to flow more, some of it could be pleasant and really interesting, and some of it could be horrifying. And that's why I think a lot of I'm trying not to go too far down the rabbit hole. So I'm thinking about like the many depictions of Shakti, and how sometimes she's horrifying and sometimes she's like Ma, like mother. Mm-hmm. So she can take on many, many different forms. And I say she because this is the energy of the body, of the form. So, but ultimately, what it is the sort of merger of the mind and the body. As the mind starts to merge with the body, what it ends up doing is it gives the subconscious, the unconscious, the permission to open up more. And as there's permission to open up more, this energy will continue to rise. I remember when my roots started, my base energies started to purify and started to open up more. I went through a phase, this is maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, not a little bit longer, where the sexual energy was so extraordinarily intense. I just completely overwhelmed almost, because that was the part of my system, my energy system. The energy was filling in that space, and I was beginning to fill and fill and fill and fill. Anything which was not authentic had to be purged. And again, Kundalini is often equated to being like fire. So that it's the whole burning process of purging that which is inauthentic, that which is not pure. So, but again, it's always about the ego connecting to the form. And as you connect to the form, there's indirectly permission granted to the unconscious, the subconscious, to release content and bring it to the surface. And that's why meditation is extremely important. If people are doing all these practices without meditation, they're walking around projecting their impurities all over the place. So, and I've known people like this where they're all about the practices, but they don't ever sit in silence and they don't practice mindfulness. So they end up projecting their inauthentic aspects all over the place. So hopefully that's somewhat clear. It's a deep topic.
Yeah, I just want to thank you so much. Thank you for that, and thank you for explaining. There is one word I just need you to maybe explain a bit or elaborate a bit on it. What do you mean here by impurities? When you say impurities, like give me examples of impurities. What do you mean by that?
Well, I'll use when I was going through my sexual energy, like awakening, I would say the impurities were, for me, again, I'll speak for myself, had to do with fantasy. And so because as the impurities start to rise to the surface, those things which are inauthentic, they will materialize in the form of thought, of mind stuff. And so the mind stuff is there for us to observe, to be objective, to witness. And so at that point in my life, it became, because it was sexual energy, and sexual energy is such a loud voice, it's such a loud energy, it's such a potent energy, it's such an embodied energy, it's so rich. What it would do is it was rising to the surface, and I had so much content, and the content was related to my 20s largely, because that's what I was purifying, was my 20s. The whole decade of my 20s was full of experimentation and sexual fantasy and pornography, and I was a hedonist.
Yeah.
So I indulged. And so when I got to the point where this had to be cleared, it was very challenging to simply be present with sexual fantasies as they came to the surface, and as opposed to me then attaching to it and acting out. So I had to keep the energy neutral as opposed to positive, because as soon as I started to positively attach to that energy, I wanted to act it out. I wanted to try it out. So that's kind of what I'm talking about in terms of knowing when the sexual energy rises to the surface. Just because something crosses your mind doesn't mean you're supposed to do it. It's about your understanding. It's about your understanding and your ability to witness something, and not necessarily to repress or express.
Yeah, I don't know if that also like kind of goes into the same context. Like I would always ask my clients, like, how much sex is enough sex? So is it quality or quantity? So I always kind of like pose this question just in kind of like I'm echoing what you're saying. You don't have to. Sometimes people just don't question their desires. Oh my God, I feel that, or I'm thinking about that, so I have to act on it. No, you have to kind of pause and ask yourself this question: how much sex is enough sex? Or do I really want to try this out? Is it coming from me, or is it a friend, or is it an impression from a porn thing that I've seen, or what do I want? I mean, exactly that simple question: quality or quantity? What do I want, really? Rather than just, going and just, as you said, acting on it, or, kind of doing it without really questioning.
Yep.
Yeah.
Agree.
Oh my God. Very intense. I could go on for hours and hours of questions.
Well, yeah, I mean,
okay.
Yeah, those sorts of topics, I mean, dealing with kink and fantasy and all that sort of thing. I think some people, my theory is that every human being is here to filter certain content. We come onto this planet with certain skills, certain attributes, our karma, whatever you want to call it. If you're talking about astrology, you're talking about the energy of your South Node or Pluto, whatever it is. We've come into this lifetime to filter certain content. So we're here to become really good filters of that content. And just so happens for myself personally, me needing to filter the many various expressions of sex and sexuality. So kink and fantasy and all these things, and learning how to, like, again, I didn't understand this in my 20s. Things would pop into my head and I would go, I was very proactive, and I would just go do it. And so, and often I discovered that fantasy is better than reality, and probably in my case, 75, 80, 90% of the time. So yeah, big topic.
Well, in my humble opinion, I think that this kind of helped you, because now you kind of like, you cannot help anybody if you did not really kind of been there, done that. It's going to be from an intellectual level rather than experiential level. So I think all our experiences in life kind of pave the way to the path that we're supposed to take eventually.
Agree.
Maybe. Maybe.
Absolutely true.
Yeah, maybe. No judgment, I think. No judgment. So I thank you so much again. That was so much helpful, informative. I'm sure that my audience is going to agree with that, and it was very rich, and I think we would need another part 2 to finish all the questions I have. But for now, thank you so much, Akal, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your passion and your teachings on your channel. And again, I'll put a link to Suma Arts, your YouTube channel and your website.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, have a lovely day.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay. No, you're very welcome. Yay!